Drawing by Ted Hughes. Drawing calmed you. Your poker infernal pen was like a branding iron. Objects suffered into their new presence, tortured into final position. As you drew, I felt released, calm. Time opened when you drew the market at Benidorm. I sat near you, scribbling something. Hours burned away. The stall keepers kept coming to see you had them properly. We sat on those steps in our rope soles and were happy. Our tourist novelty had worn off. We knew our ways through the town's runs. We were familiar, foreign objects. When he'd sold his bananas, the banana seller gave us a solo violin performance on his banana stalk. Everybody crowded to praise your drawing. You drew doggedly on, arresting details, till you had the whole scene imprisoned. Here it is. You rescued forever our otherwise lost morning. Your patience, your lip-gnawing scowl got the portrait of a marketplace that still slept in the Middle Ages, just before it woke and disappeared under the screams of a million summer migrants and the cliff of dazzling hotels. As your hand went under Heptonstall, to be held by endless darkness, while my pen travels on, only 200 miles from your hand, holding this memory of your red, white spotted bandana, your shorts, your short-sleeved jumper, one of the 30 I lugged around Europe, and your long brown legs propping your pad, and the contemplative calm I drank from your concentrated quiet in this contemplative calm. Now I drink from your stillness that neither of us can disturb or escape. Okay, in my analysis of this poem, it's considerably longer than others, so I've decided to sort of split it in the middle into two sections about here. So I'll deal with the first half and the second half of the poem, and it obviously goes onto the other page. And then I will end with a very short section, sort of concluding about what the significance of the drawing is, looking at the title, but also looking at the representation of Plath's art and the meaning that that carries throughout the poem. Right, so firstly, the scene in which the poem is set is Benidorm. And this is a reference to Hughes's and Plath's honeymoon. So the couple lived here a few weeks shortly after they got married in 1956. And they were on a honeymoon and they lived here for a bit. So Anne Skier, leading critic on Hughes, describes this whole scene as sunlit and timeless, in which they are happy, relaxed and calm, yet busy. So there's this idea of indolence, timelessness, there's the sun. It's a really beautiful scene. They're relaxed, they're calm, they're happy and busy. And she even goes as far to say that they are honeymooning in a paradisal garden. So really the setting is described as something almost Edenic by Skier here, picturesque, beautiful. And of course it is a famous holiday destination still to this day. So, immediately in the first short phrase of the poem, drawing calmed you, the opening statement is simple. The simplicity of it enforces the idea that the tone of the poem is going to be somewhat peaceful. We've got the calmed you, we've got this idea of peacefulness. And equally, it's underpinned, however, and we don't know this yet, but it's underpinned by an instability of sort of hellish imagery. So I'm just going to point out with my highlighter now where in the poem perhaps this tranquility and peacefulness is contradicted with the language that Hughes chooses to use. And, going into the next section. And so the words I'm highlighting are all sort of quite dark, quite miserable, hellish, particularly at the top here, words that really just sort of undermine almost the peace that's set out in the poem. So as ever with Hughes, and as ever in the birthday letters, there is this idea of contrast. Contrast, in fact, is a key theme in the poem, and I'll point out more features, paradoxes as we go on. Drawing calmed you. We've got this idea of you that's going to be repeating itself a lot. You're straight on. Poker, infernal pen. Got some nice plosive alliteration there. Now, was like a branding iron. And this line is enjambed into the next line. So the effect of the enjambment is to focus our attention on the isolated poker infernal pen, which of course has this sort of hellish imagery. Really intriguing words to describe her pen here. Just looking at an ordinary pen, poker and infernal are not words that come to mind, but they are satanic in a way. And again, this idea of branding iron. Perhaps it could be commented on the ending of drawing and branding. Objects isolated on its own, more enjambment. There is a lot of enjambment in the poem. In fact, you can just see it as we're coming down. And I will not focus too heavily on every example, but as long as you bear in mind that there is a lot of enjambment in the poem. Objects suffered into their new presence, tortured into final position. In fact, I'd add these to our bank of dark words that underpin the poem. And this idea of a final position too. Essentially what this is suggesting is that in her art, in her drawing, Plath is sort of pushing and torturing objects into her work, into their final set position. So it has this sort of dark imagery to it. And the calm scene has these fiery undertones. As you drew. The choice of the word as here suggests that it's happening continuously with her action. So we don't know what's happening yet deliberately, but as Plath is drawing, continuous with her action, but then suddenly contrasted I. This is Hughes obviously now, so Hughes comes into the poem. We've got another perspective. As you drew, I felt released, calm. So it's almost as if every moment that Plath is drawing, Hughes is being controlled by it. But not controlled, because we get this idea of calm. This idea of a release. And actually, we call this construction here, and this is a new phrase, parataxis. And it is when you place two phrases, one after the other, without a sort of connecting word, a conjunction, and it's a bit like asyndeton. So this is called a parataxis. I felt released and calm. But what's the effect of this? Well, it actually sort of shows a spin on the words of released and calm. And it could also suggest here that whilst released and calm are the same, released actually almost has sadistic connotations, and you have to bear with me here. So the idea of release can also mean exhilaration, excitement. So it's almost as if Hughes is exhilarated by the torturing that Plath's and the suffering that Plath's drawing has brought about. So yeah, there's that really interesting contrast there. And a lot of this poem is about contrast. Critic Sutton draws out the fact that the poem has a juxtaposition of domestic familiarity and the embers of volatility. I really like that one there. The embers of volatility, the embers of change, and even a pun on ember there as well. So that's Critic Sutton. There's this calm scene with its fiery undertones, as I keep on going back to. Time opened. Time is a key theme in this poem, so stick with me. Opened. So for Plath, the drawing opens her time. But just so I remind myself later on, there's a big contrast down here. And in fact, it doesn't open it, it does the opposite, it arrests it. So there's a contrast down here. Time opened when you drew the market at Benidorm, which I've described, this is where it's set. I sat near you scribbling something. Some lovely sibilants here. It moves, gives the poem a fluidity, a movement to it that the enjambment has already built up. I sat near you scribbling something. The idea of scribbling suggests that Hughes is writing at the same time as Plath is drawing. So there is a duality of the creative processes, which here sort of enforces the idea that in their marriage they parallel each other in certain ways. But then equally, the word for scribbling does suggest a sort of a type of drawing, really. So it's a clever use of word there. I sat near you scribbling, and then something. Probably not as good as Plath's rigid attention to detail. Plath has an enormous attention to detail. Hours burning away. The storekeepers. It's one of Hughes's favourite things, compound word. Brings things together, fuses things. Kept coming to see you had them properly. We sat on those steps. This is, I think, the first appearance of this collective pronoun. And it's the idea that it's no longer this separation between you and I, but it's a harmony. They're together. They're on their honeymoon. They've just been married, we must remember. In our rope soles. There's a nice paronomasia here, or it's just a technical term for pun, but essentially the effect of this paronomasia, is that it creates a pun with the word soul. So soul can be one's soul, as in S-O-L-E, but it can also be soul, as in S-O-U-L. And the word rope here as well can mean a rope as in something that fastens something together, a cohesive instrument. So as well as a rope being like fibre using to connect things, the word rope can also be something cohesive that fastens things together. So we sat on those steps in our rope soles, in our two joined souls, and were happy. And were happy. The simplicity of this statement, but the effect of this is quite important amidst all of these contrasts. Our tourist novelty, i.e. they're very new to this place, but actually they aren't. Again, this enjambment had worn off. It just like the soles of their feet, the soles had worn off, the tourist novelty had worn off. We knew our own ways through the town's runs. Lots of W's here, alliteration. They knew their own ways, we, through the town's runs, plural. We were familiar foreign objects. Really fascinating oxymoron here that, again, is enjambed. It's split up across the line. And that obviously is a contrast between the word familiar, but then foreign, which is the exact opposite objects. When he'd sold his bananas, the banana seller gave us a solo. It's this very specific attention to detail of specific features in the marketplace that Hughes then carries on with. He gave us a solo violin performance on his banana stalk. Everybody crowded to praise your drawing. I just love the simplicity of this statement. It's a short sentence amidst all this enjambment and séjour that I've kind of skipped over deliberately because it's so omnipresent. We have this short phrase that I guess structurally draws more attention to it. On the note of structure, notice how the whole form of the poem, in fact, is in this long, relaxed, digressive style. And this is because, I believe it's because Plath and Hughes are in a place where they're familiar with it. It's a familiar setting where they're living. So Hughes can afford to give this sort of like lazy style and form to the poem. Everybody crowded to praise your drawing. And then we've got, you drew doggedly on arresting details. Doggedly means sort of persistently, with tenacity. But it also has connotations of something quite grim, like having to push through something hard, as something admirable. You drew doggedly on arresting details. This is alliteration of the D's, which is also known, to use its technical term, as dental alliteration. On arresting details. Arresting, again, we come back to this contrast here. So whilst time has opened, the drawing has opened time, it also arrests in time what is depicted in the poem. So there's this contrast to this earlier statement. And then this continues with the word imprisoned, which suggests something that Plath's own work is imprisoning herself in it. Till you had the whole scene, as well as the scene, imprisoned. The idea of imprisoned gives me a comparison to the first line of The Blackbird, which was one of the earlier poems I've done in this series, where it says, "You were the jailer of your murderer, which imprisoned you." This idea of imprisonment, this idea of being trapped, is very common because of Plath's own mental condition and her eventual suicide. So Hughes draws on this again till you have the whole scene imprisoned. And that ends the first section. Right, section 2 opens with something we call a deictic, which is spelled D-E-I-C-T-I-C. And it's basically when words like here or there, showing the position, location of something. That's quite an oversimplified definition, but that's if we want to use a technical term for here. But rather, I find striking the 3-word, really short statement sandwiched between that end stop and that medial caesura, which creates the idea of something vivid, something that Hughes wants to draw us in with. He basically has an imaginary picture that he is pushing before the reader's eye, just as it is before Hughes's eyes. So here it is, imagines that it's sort of in front of us. And this idea of presenting something which is absent as if it were present is a common theme, not just in this poem, but across the birthday letters. Presenting something that absent as if it were real or present, and yet it will come up over and over again. You rescued forever are otherwise lost morning. Again, you is now going to start a lot of the phrases as the tone of the poem shifts. You, your. In fact, almost every sentence starts with this you. You rescued forever are otherwise lost morning. Forever is en jambes again. Your patience, your lip-gnawing scowl. This really fascinating, probably one of my favourite compound adjectives that Hughes is using here. Your lip gnawing. It basically, as Plath is drawing, she has this scowl, lip gnawing scowl. Perhaps a bit of a far-fetched reference, but in the Bible, there's a lot of references to gnashing and gnawing. So it could be, again, this play on sinners, or devils, or demons, a lot of gnawing and gnashing. So it could be a biblical reference, again. Got the portrait of a marketplace. Your patience, your scowl, got the portrait of a marketplace. This is obviously the one in Benidorm that we've been referring to. That still slept in the Middle Ages. This idea of stasis. But then a fascinating use of the Middle Ages here. It's essentially showing that this is centuries old. That Plath is being close to nature and has this instinctive feel to it, instinct, which Hughes likes a lot, nature and instinct. And the idea of slept is really fascinating because he's personifying, obviously, the marketplace as something that falls asleep, but then suddenly, just before it woke and disappeared. So sleeping and waking, Hughes has this sort of continuous sense of reawakening, which is occasioned by Plath's death. Plath's death has brought on this awakening in Hughes, just as he describes the marketplace, and disappeared, complete evaporation. And then I just want to point out words like just before, and then we've got things as your hand, just before, as your hand. Where else? While my pen. It gives the poem a bit of a temporal shift, which is a shift in time, in tense. And I mentioned there's a lot of contrast, which Sutton pointed out above. There is contrast between time, between past and present memory, which is a theme that dominates Hughes a lot. There's contrast between Hughes and Plath, obviously, in this poem, which will become more apparent near the end. And there's contrast between this sleepy marketplace and then suddenly, under the screams of 1,000,000 summer migrants and the cliff of dazzling hotels. There is a contrast between a sleeping market with a dazzling tourist hotspot. And screams and migrants, the choice of words here are interesting as well. The idea of something more artificial, which is being compared to something more natural, and also something transitory, passing. Transitory, yeah. And the cliff of dazzling hotels. As, it's another one of these as words, which is joins together the images of Benidorm, which is where they are, and we're going to find out Heptonstall, a place called Heptonstall, which is where Plath was buried. It's a small little village in North Yorkshire, near where Hughes was born himself, actually. And the cliff of dazzling hotels, as it's going to join together the scene of Benidorm, which is the whole poem has been described, but now suddenly it takes on a different tone. But there's a shift. As your hand went under Heptonstall, she was buried there, to be held by endless darkness. There's a characteristically Hughes shift here. This idea of endless darkness. Plath has these frantic attempts, or has had these frantic attempts to imprison the life of the market scene, whereas now Plath herself is being imprisoned by death. Of course, this exists in the birthday letters because they were written about Plath after her suicide. And here we are. While my pen travels on only 200 miles from your hand. I'd just like to point out the use of number here. Million, 200. Suddenly the poem's becoming even more specific. Gone from something quite general and broad brushstroke to some specific examples, now to even numbers. 1,000,000, 200 miles. Now, I've missed out some super important bits here that actually start all the way at the top with pen, because these are examples of metonymy or synecdoche. What is that? It's when, let's see if I can get this right, it's when you use small words as representations of a larger thing. So, for example, the pen is a synecdoche for Hughes's creative art of writing. Or the hands are a synecdoche for the whole of Plath, the whole of Hughes, or her art of drawing, rather. And there's this sort of poignant intimacy created by the synecdoche and the focus in on the hands in particular, which can be seen across other Hughes's poems as well. That Hughes is searching for something tangible, something that he can touch, that he can reach out for, to cling on to in this sort of long-term objectives. His long-term objectives, rather, are to reach out to get Plath back. And they are, as well as being long-term, they are long gone. So here we are. We've got the use of hands. We've got the use of Ted linking hands with Plath, both in the past and in the present. And another common theme of the birthday letters is, in this synecdoche, is the idea of words being substituted or being signs for what is real. So rather than the thing itself. So words used to replace Plath, but they can never reconstitute her, basically. So this dismemberment of reality and trying to bring back Plath, but I guess ultimately failing. And then finally, onto the end of the page here, we've got holding this memory. Holding, another word for like touching. Lugged is another one, I guess. Tangibility. This idea of holding a memory, the power of memory, we've seen in the poem previous to this one in the series, A Short Film, which is analysed as a key theme, the power of memory. Of your red, white, spotted bandana, your shorts, your short sleeve jumper, and it goes on, and your long brown legs. I'd just like to point out the use of colour here. For the first time in the poem where everything hasn't quite been coloured in, it's been a black and white sketch. Suddenly, colour comes in, suddenly colour enters, as Hughes's memory is colouring in these parts. And I'd just like to point out structurally as well, there is a lot more caesurae, a lot more punctuation in these last sets of lines because it is more complex. The moments that Hughes are trying to replicate are more complex and more varied. And you can see with things like the dashes at the end of the line, this idea of potential continuation. And then a red, white spotted bandana, your shorts, your almost accusatory short sleeve jumper, another compound. One of the 30, yet another number, here we are, lugged around Europe. And your long brown legs propping your pad. Nice bit of plosive alliteration there. And the contemplative calm. Now, if we take this phrase at face value, we assume that this is Plath's contemplative calm. But however, the nice enjambment created, I drank. It's Hughes's line. There's this idea of a transference from her state of mind to Hughes's. And this is such a common theme in the birthday letters, again, I'd like to point out, just linking everything together. Plath's own state being drawn in and always made egocentrically about Hughes, it could be argued. And then again, this anaphora of and. Hughes is trying to get closer and closer into what is ultimately a disappearing memory. I drank from your concentrated quiet in this contemplative calm, repeated again. It's repeated in such a way, if we reread it again, in this contemplative calm, that it actually links past and present. Now, present, I drink from your stillness. I drink from your stillness. I just like to focus in on the word stillness here. Stillness essentially implies that Hughes has become the subject matter, the stilled subject matter of his own poem, not least the author, that neither of us, that collective, can disturb or escape. There's a nice hissing at the end there, a sibilant hissing at the end to markedly end his poem. So now I'm going to get into some broader analysis of the title, drawing, and also the significance of Plath's art in the scheme of the poem. So if we look at the word drawing, it could both be a noun, meaning the act of drawing, and it could also be a participle, this idea of a continuous sense from the verb draw, of drawing, which is striking because it shows that in Hughes's memory, Plath is still drawing. He tries to bring this memory alive with a continuous, but it could also be the noun to describe Plath's state of just drawing things. And there's an interesting use of the word drawing here as well that critic Hyman notices. And this interesting use is the fact that the word drawing could be Plath drawing him in, Plath drawing Hughes in from the grave, almost beyond the grave. And this is her sort of exerting a control over him. But of course it could just have its face value meaning of the act of drawing, sketching. But either way, Hyman goes on to say that the title reflects fascination, sort of inspiration, determination even, and maybe even fate, drawing him in beyond the grave. So that's an interesting thing that Hyman observes about the title. And either way, the title links into the idea in the poem of perspective, because it never specifies who the one, it depersonalizes the art of drawing into just its word. It doesn't specify who does the drawing. And this is something that critic Sutton, who I referenced earlier, picks up on. Sutton observes in the poem three perspectives, three unique perspectives that a single memory is stretched out across. And they are the imagined present of Hughes as he makes the poem, so the narrator. Number two, the recalled parts of the scene itself, so where Hughes uses I. And number three, the third figure, or the you of the poem, which is Plath. So there's something interesting to note there. And then as we look at the significance of Plath's art, Plath takes objects and scenes from the objective outer worlds, so from across Benidorm, to the subjective inner vision of her art. So there's this transformation from the objective to the subjective. And the credit for this idea goes to Andrew Armitage, and his work on Hughes. And he notices an observant shift between these two. She sort of freezes the outside world into her own art form, which is really striking. And then actually we come back to Hyman's criticism of the poem. And Hyman observes that the relationship between art and reality, is a metaphor for the power that Plath's representations have exerted over Hughes's life. So actually the fact that art and life have a unique relationship is really just a metaphor for the control that Plath has been able to exert over Hughes through her own poetic representations, which I find really interesting, and it can easily be backed up across the poem. And then also Hyman goes on to talk about the imprisonment of the poem. And ultimately, we see all these words coming in, imprisoned, arrested, where are they? Imprisoned, arresting. But ultimately, Plath herself and Hughes himself are imprisoned subjects of her Benidorm drawing. So I guess if you could sum up the whole poem, you could talk about the fact that the drawing imprisons Hughes and Plath within it as a fixed memory. So whilst on surface reading, the poem may just be a very much simple narrative of their honeymoon, which, as Skier calls it, a happy, relaxed and calm scene. In fact, it's a lot deeper. It's full of Hughes's characteristic contrast and deeper subtextual meaning. Thank you for watching. The image on the screen now is actually Plath's own drawing of Benidorm.